I always thought my dad was the most boring person in the world, just a regular accountant who loved crossword puzzles and fell asleep to the evening news. But when he suddenly died of a heart attack, his lawyer handed me a single rusty key to a storage unit on the outskirts of town. I thought I'd find old furniture or boxes with my childhood toys. Instead, when I pushed open the heavy metal door, I was hit by the sharp smell of ozone and saw a wall of glowing monitors. It was a fully operational surveillance station, and every single camera was pointed at our house, every room, even my bedroom. My hands started to shake when I spotted a red folder on the desk. My name was written across it. For Max, only if they come. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed, unknown number. I pressed it to my ear, barely breathing. You found it, didn't you? A low, slightly distorted voice said, You need to run. Now. The phone slipped from my hands. On one of the monitors showing my front door, I saw 3 men in dark jackets. They didn't knock. One of them pulled out a tool, and a second later, the door popped open. They walked in, drawing their weapons. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I watched as these strangers tore through my things, ripped open my mattress, and smashed the walls. They were looking for what was sitting right in front of me. I grabbed the red folder, shoved it into my backpack, and sprinted out of the storage unit without bothering to lock the door. Jumping into my old Honda, I slammed on the gas. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Thousands of questions swarmed in my head, but the biggest one screamed the loudest. Who exactly was my father? After driving for a few miles, I pulled into an empty parking lot by a 24-hour gas station. My hands were still shaking. I pulled out the folder. There were no explanations or long letters inside. Just a stack of photos, a flash drive, and a small black notebook filled with my dad's small, neat handwriting. But they weren't words. They were rows of numbers, coordinates, and some kind of acronyms. One of the photos showed my dad, but he looked different. Younger, with a scar on his cheek that I had never seen, wearing a military uniform with no insignia. Standing next to him was another man. I squinted. Was that the guy who just called me? Suddenly my car window shattered into a million pieces. A hand in a leather glove grabbed me by the collar and violently yanked me out of the cabin. I hit the wet asphalt, scraping my palms. The wind was knocked out of my lungs. A man towered over me, aiming a gun right at my face. "Where's the drive, kid?" he hissed. I tried to crawl backward, but he stomped his heavy boot down onto my chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," I choked out. He clicked off the safety. His eyes were dead and empty, like a guy for whom killing was just a routine chore. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the gunshot. A loud crack rang out, but there was no pain. The weight vanished from my chest. I opened my eyes and saw my attacker lying next to me, clutching a bleeding shoulder. A man in a long coat stepped out of the shadows. It was the guy from the photograph. "Get up, Max," he barked, not even looking at me, keeping his gun raised. "If you want to live, move." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my backpack and ran after him toward a black SUV parked in the shadows behind the gas station. We peeled out, leaving a cloud of burnt rubber behind us. "Who are you?" My voice cracked. What the hell is going on? Why did my dad... Your dad was an idiot. He cut me off sharply. He was glued to the rearview mirrors, his jaw clenched tight. And a hero, but mostly an idiot. My name is Anton. We worked together. Worked where? In accounting? I let out a bitter laugh, though nothing about this was funny. Anton shot me a look that was equal parts pity and annoyance. Your dad didn't do taxes, Max. He was an auditor, but not for companies, for governments, for corporations that hold more power than entire countries. He found holes in their systems, dirty money, black ops, and then he sold that intel to people who could use it. Are you saying he was a blackmailer? I'm saying he walked a very thin line, and a week ago he slipped. He found something that was never meant for sale, something people will kill for without a second thought, and he hid it. I instinctively hugged my backpack closer to my chest. The flash drive, I realized. Anton nodded. Yeah, but don't think it's that easy. The drive is encrypted. The key to it was in your dad's head. Or, he glanced at my bag, in whatever he left for you. We drove all night, ditching cars twice. Anton operated with paranoid precision. He made me throw my phone into a river, bought 2 cheap burner flip phones, and paid for absolutely everything in cash. Right before dawn, we pulled into a seedy motel on the edge of some godforsaken town. The room smelled like damp rot and stale cigarettes. Anton immediately jammed a chair under the doorknob and pulled the blackout curtain shut. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed and dumped the contents of the red folder onto the comforter. All right, so what exactly do we have? I asked, desperately trying to cling to some shred of control. Anton stepped closer, staring down at the notebook. Coordinates. It's an old encryption method we used back in the 90s. Look. He pointed to the first string of numbers. These aren't just random digits. They're GPS coordinates, but they've been offset using a specific algorithm. He pulled his own phone from his pocket, not the burner he bought earlier, but a bulky, ruggedized device, and started rapidly punching in data. Your dad knew they were watching him. The heart attack. Anton paused, his jaw clenching. It wasn't natural. They injected him with a compound that doesn't leave a trace. My breath hitched. My dad didn't die of a medical condition. He was murdered. A hot wave of pure anger rose from the pit of my stomach to my throat. I pictured his pale face in the morgue, his cold hands that I'd held for the very last time. Who is they? I whispered, my voice coming out harsher than I expected. The Aegis Syndicate, a private intelligence firm that does the dirty work for the global elite. They build algorithms capable of destabilizing economies, rigging elections, wiping out competitors. Your dad got his hands on their crown jewel, Project Prometheus. If this data falls into the wrong hands, or the right ones, Aegis will be utterly destroyed. Got it, Anton suddenly said, his eyes glued to the screen of his device, widening in surprise. He didn't stash it in a bank or a safety deposit box. He hid it in an old Cold War bunker, deep underneath an abandoned radar station in the Carpathian Mountains. We set out the next morning. The drive took nearly 24 hours. I drove while Anton slept in short, restless bursts, keeping his hand resting on his weapon. Every single time a black car passed us on the highway, I held my breath. When we finally arrived, the forest was dense and eerily silent. A thick fog rolled across the ground, obscuring the cracked concrete slabs that led up to the old station. We ditched the car a few miles back and hiked the rest of the way. The damp cold seeped right into my bones. Careful, Anton whispered, stopping in front of a massive rusted steel door built directly into the side of the hill. Your dad always had a sick sense of humor when it came to security systems. He clicked on a flashlight, sweeping the beam over a small electronic keypad concealed behind a piece of rotted tree bark. The code has to be in the notebook. I quickly pulled it out. On the very last page there was only one line written. The date you became a man. I froze. What did that mean? My 18th birthday? The day I graduated college? Think, Max, Anton hissed. They're right behind us. I can feel it. The date I became a man. My mind drifted back to one specific evening. I was 14. We had gone on a hiking trip, and I ended up breaking my leg. My dad carried me on his back for 6 miles through the pitch-black woods. When we finally made it to the ER, he looked at me, utterly exhausted and caked in mud, and said, "You didn't cry once. Today, you became a man." That was August 12th, 0812. I punched in the 4 digits. A heavy mechanism inside the door clicked, and it slowly swung open with a deafening metallic screech. We descended into the pitch black. The air was stale, reeking of dust and copper. The beams of our flashlights cut through the dark, highlighting ancient control consoles covered in decades of grime. Right in the center of the room sat a modern server rack, humming quietly. It was hooked up to an autonomous generator. "This is it," Anton said, approaching the machine. He took the flash drive from my bag and plugged it into a port. The monitor flared to life, flashing a prompt for a final password. But before I could get a word out, a sound echoed through the bunker that made the blood freeze in my veins. Footsteps. A lot of them. "Step away from the console, Anton," a calm, authoritative voice called out. Blinding beams from tactical flashlights pierced the gloom of the corridor. We were instantly surrounded by a dozen heavily armed men. In the center stood a man in an immaculate, absurdly expensive suit that looked entirely out of place in this filthy tomb. His hair was slicked back flawlessly, and a smug, condescending smile played on his lips. "Did you really think you could outrun us?" the man in the suit asked. Anton slowly raised his hands, but his entire body was coiled like a spring. "Victor," Anton spat the name like it was poison. "You were always too predictable." Victor, clearly the head of this Aegis syndicate, shifted his gaze to me. "And you must be Max. You look a lot like your old man, just as stubborn, and just as dead, if you don't punch in that password." He gave a slight nod to one of his goons. The guy stepped up and pressed the cold barrel of an assault rifle directly against my temple. A single drop of freezing sweat rolled down my spine. "I don't know the password," I said, staring Victor dead in the eyes. "Liar," he smirked. "Your father left you the keys. You just have to figure out the logic. Type it in. Or I'll blow your kneecap off, and we can continue this chat in a much less comfortable setting." I looked at the glowing screen. The password hint box was completely blank. I shot a glance at Anton. He gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the keyboard, his hand slowly drifting down toward his waistband. I rested my trembling fingers on the keys. What would my dad use? What was the most important thing to him? "Forgive me." I typed the words. The screen flashed an angry red. "Error." The guard slammed the butt of his rifle into the back of my knee. I cried out in pain, dropping to one knee, barely catching myself on the edge of the server desk. "Try again," Victor said calmly. I looked at Anton one more time, and suddenly it all clicked into place. The notebook, the surveillance station, the engineered heart attack. My dad knew they were going to kill him. He knew they would come for me. He didn't leave me all this so I could hand over the data. He left it for me so I could destroy it and take them down with it. I traced the heavy cables running from the back of the server. Hidden in the shadows underneath the desk was a compact metal box with a blinking red LED. It wasn't just a generator. It was rigged with C4. Dad had turned the bunker into a giant booby trap. The password wasn't the decryption key, it was the detonator. I remembered the phrase he used to say to me every night before bed when I was a little kid terrified of the dark. I quickly typed, "The light wins." I hit enter. A bright green text crawled across the screen. "Phoenix protocol initiated. Detonation in 30 seconds. Victor's face contorted. The smug calmness vanished, replaced instantly by raw, animalistic terror. "Kill them!" he shrieked. Anton moved like lightning. He whipped out his gun and put a bullet straight through the guard standing over me. Blood sprayed across my cheek. Anton grabbed me by the collar and hurled me behind a massive rusted iron panel of vintage machinery. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Bullets ricocheted off the metal, sending sparks flying into the air. The room quickly filled with deafening noise and choking cordite smoke. 20 seconds. An automated electronic voice blared from the server's speakers. "Make for the exit," Anton roared, laying down covering fire. We scrambled toward a side corridor that Anton must have scouted on our way in. Victor's men were in full panic mode. They were firing blindly while simultaneously tripping over each other, trying to bottleneck through the main exit. I ran faster than I had ever run in my entire life. My lungs burned like fire. My heart felt like it was going to tear its way out of my chest. We sprinted down the narrow, pitch-black tunnel, our path illuminated only by the frantic strobe of muzzle flashes echoing behind us. 5 seconds! Anton shoved me hard to the dirt and dove on top of me, shielding my body with his own the exact second we cleared the tunnel and spilled out into the forest. The earth violently convulsed. A deep, impossibly loud explosion ripped through the silence of the night. A massive pillar of roaring flame and concrete dust erupted from the bunker entrance, completely uprooting the closest pine trees. The shockwave tore across the ground, flattening us completely. A heavy rain of dirt and jagged rocks showered down on our backs. I lay there pressed into the wet grass, totally deafened, choking on the acrid smoke. A high-pitched ringing echoed in my ears. Once the dust finally began to settle, I lifted my head. The bunker entrance was completely sealed off by thousands of tons of collapsed stone and shattered concrete. Aegis, Victor, their precious project Prometheus, all of it was down there, buried forever in a makeshift tomb. I looked over at Anton. He was sitting up in the dirt, breathing heavily, casually wiping a streak of dark blood from a nasty gash above his eyebrow. He looked back at me, and for the very first time since we met, he cracked a genuine smile. "You're dead," he rasped, coughing slightly. "A genius idiot." I started to laugh. It was a wild, hysterical, nervous laughter that quickly dissolved into coughing, but I just couldn't stop. I was alive. We sat there in the woods until the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting its morning light on the smoldering ruins of what used to be a terrifying global secret. My father didn't leave me a fortune, and he certainly didn't leave me a quiet life. He left me the raw truth about the kind of dark world we actually live in, and he left me the strength to fight back against it. These days, I live under a different name in a small, quiet European town. I have a new job, a new circle of friends, a completely new life. But every single night, right before I drift off to sleep, I double-check the heavy deadbolts on my doors and cycle through the feeds on the security cameras I installed myself. I don't think of my dad as a boring accountant anymore. I know exactly who he was. And more importantly, I know who I am now. The light wins. But sometimes to make that happen, you have to strike a match in a room full of gunpowder.